Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the conference and welcome to the panel Against Merit, How Disabled Students Subvert Intelligent Essentialism. So this is something that Will and I'd like to think the panelists as well, are very excited about. It's been a long time coming. I'm going to make some brief motivational comments, then go around and do introductions. And then the way that this panel is going to work is that I will pose a series of questions relating to this institution of merit that we're talking about, and we will think about them together, and the contributors will share their experiences and their thoughts. So first of all, my name is Virgil. Um, I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to myself here. Visual description. I am a mixed race person who's sort of reclining on a blurred background. I'm wearing what I would like to think is fashionable outfit, namely a cream colored bow tie and a cream and brown striped sweater over a brown button down. And so I am a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. I work in critical disability theory and in philosophy, also from sort of a more genealogical or critical perspective of statistics. What's important in my work particularly is being an addict. That is a lot of my relationship to disability, and I run this blog called The Addicts Collective. So motivational comments. I want to bring up a little bit as we begin this panel, this concept that Shelley Tremaine introduced, I believe, known as ableist exceptionalism, this idea that disability alone among those categorization schemas that we talk about in philosophy, disability alone is not socially constructed. That disability alone is somehow beyond analysis, beyond critique, or that whatever analyses we do of it are revelatory rather than creative or deconstructive. This is a bias that affects a tremendous amount of work that has been amply discussed in critical disability theory. And one particularly insidious variant of this, I think, and this is an opinion that, I know at least Will shares, and we're about to get the contributor's opinion, is that intellectual essentialism is a particularly insidious variant. It's this sense that intellectual disability is a final frontier, that we're the battering ram at the gate of deconstructing that in sort of a microcosm of the way that disability more generally, still disabled people have trouble agitating for their political status, even in critical communities. So it's the fact that ideological diffusion of these ideas is the exception rather than the rule. It's the fact that I feel like I have to argue for the contingent nature of intelligence, even in such a critical space as this. It's the fact that I reckon there is probably not even one intellectually disabled scholar in this audience. These, I think, are really important things. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. The fundamental sort of tension that we are critical, or we want to be, and we want to criticize these institutions and express solidarity with our intellectually disabled comrades and colleagues. And yet we as scholars, our positionality with respect to institutions, with respect to academia, seems to be in large part based on some sort of essentialism, or at least value essentialism, about the notion of intelligence, the notion of rationality, and such things. So I'm hoping that we can make some sorts of strides here, that we can find out how to more awarely do counterconcepts, how to more awarely be critical of this or be aware of it. I'm saying aware a lot because I think this is really new ground, and it's tricky to talk about. It's very reflexive to be essentialist about these things. Okay, so I'm going to start by allowing Will to introduce himself here. Will, can you please share a little bit about yourself, give a visual description, and talk about your research, your work, and the things that are important to you, maybe a bit about your relationship to the concept of intellectual merit?
Sure. So, just a visual description. I'm a white guy with a pink shirt on, a blue blazer, and I'm sitting in like an inoffensive renter, like off-white uh wall. I mean, you might think that like I'm being held captive, but I'm not. Like I have today's um but but yeah, so I'm a PhD student at Stonybrook University. I actually got my master's where Cal is currently studying. And on top of that, I work in biopolitics, philosophy of disability. But my real like institutional claim would be that I'm a scholar of the French philosopher Michel Foucault. But also I'm the co-host of the philosophy podcast Acid Horizon, which you can find, I guess, by Googling it. And other than that, yeah, my relationship to the question of merit is my relationship to the question of historical a priori. What are the fundamental bases or foundational functions that allow for other apparatuses to operate, other mechanisms, whether they be educational, institutional, medical, to function? And the question of merit is at least one of the ones that remains to be, if not overturned, not even critically examined. And part of it is because of intelligence essentialism, but I also think that the role that merit plays is a remarkably disciplinary one. Merit doesn't just function as a post hoc justification for systems of discipline, but in fact color the entire experience of any given disciplinary apparatus. So merit is not just a discursive object with which different subjectivities have a relationship to, whether they're merited or not, but in fact structure your entire experience as it regards to sort of cascading through these disciplinary apparatuses from your home to your school to your prison to your college to your PhD. And at the same time, my experience as a student has been colored by this at a very modernist university. I'm at a program where the limit really is rationalist philosophy. I love my colleagues, but they're all ultimately Hegelians. So really attempting to have a kind of relationship with the history of philosophy that I want to, I'm kind of colored as I think unreasonable or kind of the villain in relation to the history of philosophy. And I'm happy to play the role of the court jester. But I also think that the notion of merit is directly related to the dispersal of bodies within disciplinary apparatuses. And I know that this dispersal of bodies, space and bodies, is a largely maligned platitude now, but I mean that in a very literal way, where physically we all are. So yeah, I'll move to, because I brought up Duquesne, we'll move to Cal.
Yeah, so Cal, can you tell us a little bit about, I'll just say the question each time, about yourself, a visual description about your work, the things that are important to you, and your relationship to notions of value in the academy?
Yeah. So what was the first one of those? Sorry. I
Your
forgot.
visual description?
Yes. Okay. So I'm Cal. I have long, ish brown hair, wearing a brown flannel shirt with a light blue headset. I have many desks of bookbinding material strewn around my room behind me, and a cat yelling at the door just to my left. I Sorry, I'm nervous and also distracted. What was the remainder? My work and my research interests.
Yeah, and anything else that's, important to you or what you like to do and how you feel about merit or value as it relates
Yes,
to like
yes.
intellectualism.
Thank you. Yeah. So I do work, in case you can't tell already from my demeanor going into this, on ADHD. And I kind of try to focus on the various ways that certain experiences have actually quite damaging ramifications for various schools of thought within continental philosophy. My latest target has been various core ideas in phenomenology. However, I see this kind of research program continuing on with other thinkers like Foucault as well. In particular, a lot of, I think, to use some strong language, I think shameful analyses that have been written about the history of ADHD. Um, I think the unique perspective that I kind of take on this issue of merit and intellectualism from ADHD is largely to kind of look at this to see all the different ways that there are all sorts of other ideas baked into what we understand intellectual merit to be, which is that it's never just this idea of intelligence. It's also this idea of being an obedient student or scholar. It's also kind of has this certain norms of objectivity, which requires certain levels of like emotional self-control and all sorts of other different kinds of self-control. It's also about the various ways that you're able to direct your attention, for example. And I find that, at least in my own life, all of those extra attached concepts have been what has barred my engagement or inclusion into the group of people that are associated with intelligence. So it's almost in some ways about the idea of the intelligent person rather than just the idea of intellectual merit, which involves so much more. Yeah, so that's what I think I have to add, at least right now, to this discussion. Thank you.
Perfect, Cal. Thank you. And finally, Clarissa, it's nice to meet you. Can you please, following the form that we've seen tried and true, tell us a little bit about yourself, your visual description, things that are important to you, and your relationship to the concept of merit?
Yeah, sure. First off, thanks for having me here. I'm joining from the UK, so it might be a bit dark and gloomy in here because the sun set approximately an hour ago. We're doing great. So what do I look like? Female presenting, average built against what do you call this? A gallery wall. Brown hair, micro bangs, glasses, white. Yeah, British, you can probably tell by the accent. But yeah, my relationship to merit, actually, let's start at the beginning with what I do. Like Cal, I also have ADHD. So this could be a fun round table. But yeah, my thesis, I'm working at the University of Warwick in their philosophy department. And it's a critical phenomenology of othering, which I understand as both the process and the effect, right? Being othered as both like a subject position and a kind of action, if you will. And in doing so, I use first-person narratives of social otherness concerning disability, neurodivergence, gender identity, and racialization, and do that to basically construct an account of othering as this normatively loaded perceptual and interpretative practice. And so that also kind of like segues quite nicely into my connection to merit, more so than intellectual merit, to be honest, coming from the perspective of evaluating worth and what that means in terms of social affordances and social esteem. Because as we've all kind of touched on so far, merit isn't just this simple thing of like, you've done a good job, it structures your life, and as someone in the academy, I mean, we all are, that is a very real thing in our lives, right? In order to be like in this metaphorical room, we've all met certain standards of excellence. Whether or not we've had a say in those standards remains to be seen. So yeah, obviously there's a personal connection there, and connection through my work. But again, on a personal level as well, as a late diagnosed autistic person with ADHD, I've experienced, let's say, some troubles navigating the various meritocracies that inform and structure my general experience. And now, having greater like understanding of myself and philosophical understanding and like social awareness, it's interesting to reflect on that. And so yeah, I'm excited to have these conversations today.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, I'm very excited too. These are wonderful. I just been taking so many notes, even just during these introductions, that I'm so excited to get into. But with no further ado, I want to hop in because we've got a lot to cover. So I'm going to frame. There's 5 questions here that you've all seen, but the audience, of course, hasn't. So I'm going to start by framing each question and then go around in some order. I'll switch it up. There'll be different people opining on different questions. And when it's your turn, if you're opining on some question, You can take up to 2 to 3 minutes, or if you want to keep it really short, you just have like one pithy sentence to add, like a little, like an aphorism for the ages, then by all means, no pressure to really extol at length. But whatever works for you. So this first question is about merit, scare quotes, and the state, or governance, government in general. So I want to start this off with the well-known phrase, if you're here, you're definitely familiar with it, which is from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That is generally associated with Marxism, right? Or generally like left-wing redistributive economy. What I hear in that phrase is that even at the end of history, there is an essential spectrum of ability. There is a belief that there is going to be such a thing as there are people who are more able and people who are less able. The people who are more able have to provide for the less able people. I think about the astute comments that Mish made earlier about the idea of caretaking as this kind of fundamental, essential, and privatized endeavor. So the concept of merit shows up a lot here. It shows up even in left-wing thought. It's necessary to this idea that political, social, and economic systems function as, or if not function as, then are determined in light of and respect some sort of meritocracy. And what we see, especially in a phrase like from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, is that when these systems are critiqued, often what tends to happen is that rather than throwing the whole thing away, we keep a baby out of the bathwater, and we redescribe the meritorious qualities in some other terms, some more neutral terms. So we might say, well, disabled people aren't lazy, they're just incompetent. Or often, in the history of intellectual disability and intellectually disabled depression, which some years ago, Lisha Carlson wrote one of the interesting genealogy of the institutionalization of intellectually disabled people in an earlier volume that Shelley edited. Often what we see is the redescription of behavior from sort of like antisocial to intellectually incompetent. So we change the kinds of institution or apparatus with respect to which people are being called bad or wrong, but we maintain that there's something undesirable about it. So how have you experienced this? What have you seen to be the relationship between authority and power, and your being called valuable or disvaluable, and disability? How have you experienced meritocracy, merit or anti-merit through your work? And do you think that there is a way to separate the idea of merit from the kinds of rankings or systems or categorizations that we as, obviously like very politically motivated scholars would like to critique? Can we talk about a notion of merit that doesn't have anything to do with disability, that doesn't intrinsically draw on racialization, that doesn't draw on gender? Or is meritocracy ultimately about those things? Like, are we just drawing a new line in the sand that might be a little bit to the left of where it was before, but still a line in the sand? So I hope that question makes sense. The idea is there some fact of the matter? Is there some possible thing that we should take pride in when we are called meritorious? Or are we just being told that we are assimilated according to some different value schema? Is there such a thing as real human excellence? So yeah, with that said, I'm going to open it up to questions. Let's start this time with Clarissa, and then let's go to Cal.
Sure. So this question, I don't know, I have lots of ideas about it, so I'll try not to just steamroll through through everything. But to me, I mean, this is possibly an obvious kind of way to start this, but we have these views of what a given phenomena is, right, within societies, and those are quite persistent. They're kind of temporally stable, even if we want to say that they're dynamic, and I would say that they are. They're not these absolute universal truths. And those, as we've already mentioned, inform and quite literally structure the experiences that you can have, the things that are afforded to you, the way in which you're seen and understood in the world, what you can do, and so on and so forth. And merit, I think we can say unequivocally, is a part of that, particularly in Western capitalistic societies. And I think it's something that stood out to me a lot here is the connection between productivity and merit, which I think go hand in hand quite synonymously almost, at least in Western societies. And, you know, what comes to mind is, you know, the American dream and this idea that, you know, if you can just push harder, if you can just do more, it's like, you know, Gatsby at the end of the dock, you know, reaching out to the green light. You know, there's always a tomorrow where you can be more, do better. And that, yeah, if you are able to do that labor, then you can get everything, you can achieve everything that you deserve, right? There's that connection between the labor, the product, and that meaning you deserve certain things. And then the inverse is also true, right? If you can't do that labor, if you can't produce, or if you produce differently, then maybe that esteem isn't afforded to you, right? And so, yeah, like when we're talking about merit and capitalism, you know, then questions of worth and value and of excellence become these really normatively loaded things, right? Of who can work most efficiently, what bodies cost more to sustain, again, thinking of the care ethics and, you know, relations of caring. Because again, Western independence is, you know, the best thing in the world. And how dare we need to rely on other people, even though arguably we all do, but that's maybe another topic for another time. So yeah, what bodies are seen as independent, or maybe require more resources, or, you know, adaptations to the space, which again, like in our societies, have a cost associated with them and so on. So all of this is then bound up with our ideas of excellence and conformity, right? Excellence has a look, and you either meet it or you don't, or you kind of do, but not really, right? Getting into academia, you know, university is a perfect example of this. You have to get the right tests, you know, or the right scores on those tests. And even that, you know, will then dictate what kinds of places you can go to. Not everyone will want you, essentially. And so, yeah, we have this position where we have these kind of high output, low cost bodies, I think is a helpful way to think about it. These valued bodies, and those are afforded maybe the corresponding high levels of regard, authority, and power. And anything that kind of falls outside of that, bodies that fall outside of that narrow scope, are afforded lower social esteem, not afforded as many opportunities, or presented with objects, literal or ideal. By ideal, I mean like value, knowledge, stuff like that, with which to have certain experiences in their lives. And so it seems to me that when we think about it in, you know, this abstracted conceptual level, like disability is seemingly antithetical to merit. If you cannot produce, you cannot be worthy of merit. You cannot achieve excellence in this sense. Now, I personally don't think that's true, just to be very clear. But I think this is an operative idea, right? Whether implicit or explicit. And that you end up with a situation where existentially, you know, who you are, how you operate, forecloses excellence. With the kind of, I don't know, asterisk caveat of, well, if you are a disabled person and you somehow are able to, you know, converge with ideals of excellence, then you're literally exceptional. You're an exceptional case. Or you're not disabled, or disabled enough, right? Is a response that I've had personal experience of, and other people have as well. Like, oh, you're really autistic? Yes. You know, it doesn't look how you think it does all the time. It may do, but not always. And of course, this is then bound up with that, like, the medical model of disability and this idea of deficiency, and lacking capacity. And it becomes, I don't know, this very complex web of everything. And so I'm looking at my notes and getting lost in them. And recently here in the UK, something which is very on theme today, we had a assisted dying bill go through, which personally I'm very skeptical of, considering the lack of care, you know, social resources afforded to people in end-of-life care. And that can obviously be a very slippery slope. And this again seems to be tied into this idea that someone, you know, in palliative or end-of-life care, they're a burden. They can't produce, they can't sustain, and so what do we do with them? You know, they're expendable seemingly. And all of this also then led me slightly away from this political conversation that we're having around, specific political structures and things, of merit being bound up with a notion of, an ideal human, an imaginary concept, or an imagined idea of this ideal human, and that being like merit worthy, you're inclining toward that ideal, right? Whether that's like aesthetic or intelligence or your physical capacity or dexterity skills, or what have you, your like cultural background or so on. And again, this seems antithetical to disability, like a quote, like a broken or a deficient thing, or how can that be the ideal? And so then just I'll wrap up to talk about your point of like, well, what do we do with this, right? Like, can we understand merit outside of this complex web of oppression? I fall on two sides. One is more cynical, one is less. Maybe more idealistic. The more cynical side says no, as the current state of affairs. I do not think that it's possible to kind of extricate merit from various identity-based forms of oppression, whether that's disability or otherwise. Again, because of this, imagined ideal, which so many types of people are deemed categorically to not be able to achieve. But then the less cynical side of me is thinking, well, if we change the concept, we can change the relation between that, right? Now, getting people to change their minds is difficult enough, let alone at such a scale that would make that feasible or real, quote unquote. So yeah, I think as it stands, I am skeptical of being able to unpack these things. But I don't know, at the same time, though, saying this when you're talking about pride, I still think it is a natural, normal, appropriate human response to feel pride, when you feel like you've done a good job, and I wouldn't be critical of someone for being happy with, I don't know, publishing an article or something, like achieving some milestone, which relates to merit or their intelligence. Perhaps a caveat is, well, what makes those meaningful to you outside of systems of meritocracy, which you're engaging in but aren't necessarily directly informing the values of, like, what values do you hold which make it worthwhile or meaningful to achieve those things outside of the esteem that it affords you from this objective third position. Yeah, I think that's broadly my position. I'll hand over to Cal.
Thanks so much. Now we'll move on to the Sternarian here on the on the question of merit. Cal, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you mentioned the Sterner thing, because that is going to be, I think, very important for my response. And I guess I will also say, because I forgot to include this in my own introduction, that Max Stirner is one of kind of my key interests, or at least influences, and I've organized and founded the Max Stirner Symposium, which has gone on for the past 2 years. Won't be happening this year, hopefully will be happening again the next year. But the question that kind of stands out to me about this is, in what way are we constituted such that we find the judgment of meritus or unmeritus like relevant, or like why is that meaningful to us? Why is it that we are such subjects that kind of see this almost appeal to authority through the judgment of the other? So one of the ways that I've kind of explored this notion is through kind of the notion of masking for neurodivergent people. I have a forthcoming article with in a collection on existential philosophy and disability with Brill that investigates kind of this question and kind of the complex dynamic of how it is specifically people with ADHD can internalize this kind of judgmental perspective on ourselves and come to see ourselves in terms of the other, when there's a lot of things about ADHD that directly inhibit that kind of gesture. But the details of that can kind of be set aside for the sake of this question, because in some sense, the fundamental thing that's at issue here is the structure of how it is that we come to see ourselves in terms of the other, or how it is in some way we can get out of that. And this is where Stirner comes in to this. He discusses all the time about the ways in which we come to see others and also ourselves, as well as other like objects in the world in terms of certain kinds of concepts and the fundamental antagonism that that kind of creates between us and within us as well. He explores this, I think, in a really interesting chapter that kind of critiques young Hegelian humanism that I think is really relevant to disability, where he kind of posits this notion of the inhuman or the inhuman monster as this kind of always kind of latent, ever-present, opposite identity to the idea of the human being. And it is always that which is not able to fit this generality of the human. And ultimately, this is a kind of concept that becomes internalized within us. So as we are in some way kind of antagonizing ourselves, we are always kind of trying to exclude that which is unique, particular, and individual about ourselves, that which does not fit the concept of human, in order to fully embody this kind of generality. And ultimately for him, the logic of this kind of oppression fails. It falls apart because there's this kind of hard kernel of kind of resistance to discursivity that can never really be fully incorporated, which is just kind of our concrete individuality. And I see this as kind of starting to come into play with this question, where there are these kinds of certain judgments of merit insofar as this is something that's expected of us. But it also kind of is relevant for how it is that we can get out of this. And he poses this model of the insurrection, and I kind of adapt this with the idea of a micro-insurrection. So the micro-insurrection is all of these little ways that we choose to not oppose expectations that are put on us, but part from them. So I use the example in my article of certain forms of subversive humor, where it is about, in some ways, saying something that is contrary to what is expected of you in the moment. So I will oftentimes talk about the moral virtues of theft, or I'll often just casually throw in the amphetamines that I'm on all the time in conversations just to kind of like throw people off. And hopefully you can do it in ways that doesn't like directly antagonize people, because there are all sorts of different negative consequences of that. But in that very kind of dynamic, there is also this tension here where we're still kind of having to deal with the fact that we are in a society and even kind of in a certain psychological state where we're having to make an active effort to go against our determination by other people's expectations, where these expectations still have a certain kind of hold on us, you know. And then I think the other thing that's relevant that I want to bring up here is this is kind of, and I'd be very interested to hear if Clarissa has anything to say on this, but this is kind of something I feel like I've been able to identify about the differences in the social position of people with autism and people with ADHD, insofar as it's kind of led to the neurodiversity movement, where there's, I think, two very opposite kinds of conditions that have led to very different kind of theoretical perspectives. I think generally, and I want to be careful about how I like speak on experiences that are not my own, but what I've been able to see about people with autism or autistic people is that they are in some ways objectified such that they lose their autonomy, where they are in some ways not viewed as always responsible for their actions, so because they are medicalized in this way, where everything is kind of because of their autism. It is a determination of themselves almost entirely. So there's this kind of objectification that leads to a response to subjectivize, to try to kind of take some of the autonomy back by rejecting this kind of over medicalization of it, which has kind of led to much more of a social model kind of perspective. Now I can speak more authoritatively on my own experiences with ADHD, but the condition of ADHD is, I think, exactly the opposite, which is you are like incessantly subjectivized, where you are always responsible for everything. There's no possible explanation that your ADHD can offer that would excuse any kind of actions that you do. It is never because of your ADHD, it is always because of some kind of moral and internal failing of you. And I think one of the kind of natural responses to this that I think some people with ADHD have kind of started to have, and I think this is something that I would defend at least to some degree, is there's actually a certain kind of virtue to medicalization in that case, because you are able to say, no, I do not always have control over these things, because there is a very real lack of autonomy with this condition. So being able to almost recognize that, yes, these are like real things that are a limit that I do not necessarily have responsibility over. And using that in some ways as a shield so that you can actually enact the autonomy you have in the rest of your life. Because when that isn't recognized, when you are viewed as responsible for everything, you are always kind of in the position of being punished, which means you can't exercise the autonomy you actually do have over other things. But this is also where, and I will try to wrap this up very quickly because this is getting onto a tangent and tangent and tangent very quickly. But this is also where I think it's very important to be very critical about how it is we kind of use this medicalization as a shield. Because we don't want this to be just another kind of determination that we're subject to. This is where I think Stirner is very helpful, because his entire kind of like theoretical impulse is to be critical about the way that we as concrete subjects relate to our ideas as things that we think. So making sure that we are cognizant of the fact that like I take priority over any kind of like notion of what ADHD is as a medical or social concept that I can strategically use to empower me further to act in various situations where things are expected of me. So not letting that kind of take on a life of its own, not treating that notion as independent from me, but still being able to kind of use it to protect yourself in certain ways. I think that's everything I have, and that was a lot, and I apologize if that was maybe difficult to follow, but thank you for the time.
Okay, so I think we're gonna have to play this a little bit more by ear than I had thought in terms of getting through the questions. I think that, like, I hope this isn't springing some sort of last minute change in anybody. But given that this has proven to be very rich, just in terms of letting everybody talk as they feel moved, I doubt we'll get through all of this. What I really want to hit is genealogical interpretations of IQ, and then intellectual disability. And if we can talk a little bit about revolting in the academy, that's okay. But the like mass disabling events question is definitely gonna go. Sorry to anybody, but that was a favorite question of mine. But this is just too interesting. So because I do want to actually discuss the contributions that you're making in real time. So, Will, is there anything you want to say about what the contributors have provided and about these ways of making sense of ourselves and our contexts?
There are sort of two things. The first is the juridical question of control and attributability.
Yeah.
And the second one is a question.
And the Aretaism that it invokes.
Yeah. And the question of merit and productivity, in as much as I think when you singled out the Communist Manifesto, and also these are the sentiments that are in the Critique of the Gotha program, these are things that you find even at the end of human prehistory, right? So this is a problem in the history of philosophy, but also this question of that going down to the notion of ability. It identifies that human beings aligned with their capacities is still the fundamental element of the relationship between the human philosophy and the production of a sociality, is that it has to be a capability. And so that's the first thing, is that not only does merit still exist at the end of human prehistory, it also all of these other metaphysical contributions from the history of philosophy that are supposed to be overturned and abolished by communism, right? What we see really is the problematic realization of all of the violence of the history of philosophy found at the end of human prehistory. And the other one, so what that reveals to me is finally that this can't be restricted to a particular mode of production. That I think it's insufficient to state that we have a particular mode of production now that has this relationship to merit, and that one day there will be a good merit. Because what I think we find is that it's a metaphysical question of capability. What, say, we could call like it's an anatomical political question. And then the other one has to do with this question of attributability and the subject. I think that the supposedly like liberating element of falling back on my, say, cerebral palsy for something, right, is certainly, I can certainly play those games, right? And in a book that I co-wrote with my friends at Acid Horizon, the ADAPT protests in Denver, where supposed immobility is, of course, played out on the terrain of mobility, the street, that is certainly something that can temporarily reverse a particular power relation. But I want to be really careful with how we use this notion of attributing some sort of final immutable causality that disability has to the question of attribution of either behavior or of capacity and contribution. Because I think that on the one hand, like what I would say as a jurist is, on the one hand, this is certainly what allows someone to get off of a homicide in the 21st century. It is also precisely that which enables one to say this person is a threat and is a danger. But it depends, irrespective of whether we're doing it with glee, you know, to get out of the, in this individual case, to get a defendant away from the death penalty or something, right? We're still in the terrain of social danger and social deficiency. That even though
it's the same, if I may, it's the same sort of, the contrast that you just raised is the same sort of like uncanny shifting sort of like movement of the earth underneath the fact that Foucault brings up in Birth of the Prison, that the existence of the prison is self-undermining. Like it relies on this justification that it simultaneously destroys. And I think that there's this really interesting foil that was brought up in Clarissa versus Cal's contributions, which is that on the one hand, which is like the age-old question of like essential, like de-essentialized essentialism, and the ways in which I am ultimately very sympathetic about something that sounds like essentialism, which is this idea of like, it's a little bit well, like I write in addiction, right? And there's a lot of critical addiction studies or drug user movement writers want to say that people who use drugs in, like the way that historically I have, like, no, that's just the way that those people have been written about because we're racialized or because this or that or the other. And if you actually go and interview those people, they don't use in such a dysregulated manner as they've been written about. It's actually like that's like, like a white colonist coming to, and writing about the natives as savages, and it's all made up. The thing is, though, that no, I actually did use drugs in this way that, and do in this way that a messenger from the Apollonian society will come and recognize correctly that I'm doing this in like this Dionysian way. And there's something to be proud of in that, I think, in that sort of ungovernability. It's not essential, and nothing's essential really, I don't think. But I do reject the idea that I can just push away these constructs, pathologizing or not, in terms of how they bear on my actual subjective experience. Like, being a subject means I was constituted and now here I am. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that I can't be changed. It doesn't mean anything like that. But it does mean that to some extent, there's something I feel very unjustly. And I've just written this article in a collected volume edited by Melissa Fox Merton at Brill. I feel there's something very unfair about the kind of deconstructive approach that will blame subjects for buying in too much to their to the truth claims about what they're like, because I feel like I was constituted and here I am, and now you're blaming me for it. So, which is, like I was put in this pen of discourse and now I'm being put in a pen of blame, or just literally a cell, on account of behaving in the way that you wrote about me behaving. And so I feel like, you know what I mean? Like, you feel like that tension that I'm describing. I think on the one hand, we've seen in these two perspectives that were written out in very eloquent ways, or described in very eloquent ways by Clarissa and Cal, that there is a fact, there is just sort of like a fact, not an essential fact, but a fact nonetheless, that we are disabled. Maybe some of us are like able disabled, right? Like we're on the margin. And I think that's a big thing of this intellectual disability discussion, which is we as intellectually abled disabled people are the able disabled people vis-a-vis the construct of disability merits. We are at the edge and we can assimilate in this way that intellectually disabled people can't. And I've related a lot to this idea, to this important motivational feature of what Clarissa describes, where it's like, we need to come up with new, like we need to take pride in other things. We can't, we just don't. If merit is this thing that's being talked about, if merit is this kind of writing, this kind of very Apollonian construct of being this way, that's not accessible to us. But then I also relate to what Cal is describing. And obviously I would frame it in a very different kind of milieu. But that I think is the underlying tension here. We want to push this away, but we also don't want to be clinging on to our alternative so tight that it becomes essentialist. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. But what I want to maintain, though, and what I want to be skeptical of, is that we don't leave merit simply as a thing that establishes a threshold for participation. But in fact, I think it is in fact the opposite. Merit is simply the production of particular understandings of constituted subjects, and I think that it's not enough to say merit is fake. And when I say it's not enough, I'm not going to say I want to find some deeper, different, materialist way to ground the same metaphysical principle that I want.
The ontological turn.
Yeah. Like instead, I think instead it's about trying, like there needs to be a certain level, I think, of fundamental frustration about being within the university as a disabled student. Like I think still clinging to this idea and justification and self-motivation notion of merit is somewhat ridiculous. I think back to often when I was a kid, the guidance counselor made my parents go take me to an IQ test. And of course I performed.
Me too. Did that happen? Not, if anybody else wants to volunteer, that also happened to them. They were subjected to a required IQ test as a child because they were ungovernable.
Yeah.
Okay, so half the panel. That happened to half the panel.
Yeah. So
because that's the first. Because when you are ungovernable, the first presumption is that you are irrational. Then I'm not saying I'm not irrational. I'm very irrational. But like what I'm describing is that convergence where it's like everything is intellectualized and demerit or being non-meritorious is rendered as being pathologically unintelligent.
Yeah, and I think like there are moments about this in throughout my life, like whether or not it's a professor saying like this isn't graduate level work. I go, yeah, no, it isn't. You're right. I don't care, but you're right. You're not fine. I'm not rational. I'm not a human being. Like I could take all of these things on and and say, sure, I fall beautifully outside of all of these things, but I have to fall outside of all of these things in order for your claim to be true. So if this is what allows you to do this, then that's fine. But recognize that it's an inclusive exclusion and that without me, like it doesn't work. And what I don't want to do is the Derridian thing, right? Where I say like, oh, what we do is we have to find the trace and follow it all the way back to some sort of final, arche upon which we now reconstitute the entirety of history and sort of save the question of merit. I just think that it's what we talked about this morning when I called you at like 7 a.m. or whatever, where it's like all they want to do is endlessly critique power. It's like yes, like that I will never be
Are
sad.
you
Like,
are
I
the other
won't be sad.
panelists familiar with this? That there's this meme that circulates that's from ContraPoints. It's from back when she had like a brief flirtation with like the center left. Now she's back being like a democratic socialist. But she made this video about how like I think people hate Jamil or whatever, and she thought that was bad. And she made there's this meme broke containment where it's an image of her criticizing the anarchist left, or like tankies, people, the dissident left, if you will. And she says they don't want power. All they want is to endlessly critique power. The idea being that like the left reduces or abnegates all the opportunities that it has to take political control because those mechanisms are conceived as like dirty or because of internal infighting, those kinds of things. But Will and I were talking about this morning, and I mentioned this meme, and we were just like, yes, we do just want to endlessly critique power. I don't want to be a boot, crushing people and whatever. Like this is sort of like I compared it to this Nietzschean idea of being like the criminal who's whatever the boundaries are, I'm going to push them. So what Clarissa describes of this like being productive, this kind of idea of which also was brought up earlier by in Mish's presentation, this idea that there's like working time, and you have to fill that time with work. There's a schedule. I got a very bootstrap sort of notion when I was hearing Clarissa talk about it, and it's like when that is assuming that a revolution happens, right? Like, in this ideal for like thought experiments, and it's changed, it's going to be replaced with something else. And then that there's going to be pathological categories created, and I'm going to agitate against those. So like, maybe we do need to keep shifting the notion of merit, but then whatever pops up, we just keep playing whack-a-mole. Right? Like, and very much like Cal said, we're going to have these new pathological categories, and people are going to identify with those categories. And then again, there's going to be this sense of, okay, but are you over essentializing yourself in relation to this category? You got to be a little bit more Cernerian than that. Like, it's a very cyclical phenomenon, and sometimes that makes me sad.
I think that's a great place to move to the sort of next question. And if you want to frame
oh my gosh, the time.
hand it over to Cal. I think that that this is really the perfect hinge to swing the new door open.
Yeah. Wait, do you want to provide any more? Do you want to do the genealogies of IQ question? Or?
Yeah, I think that's what, like, we're right there, right at this notion of perpetually kicking the can sort of down the road of a particular historically prioritized. So why don't you introduce the problematic of IQ, and then we can.
Yeah. This I'll try to make faster. We should just, I don't know, the four of us should move to a desert island and just sublate all day, right? Like, okay. But so the reason that I sort of like came up with the idea for this panel is that I have a lot of grievances with the way that IQ is construed. And the thing is that critiques of IQ are abundant, right? Everyone's always critiquing IQ, especially because nowadays with the fascist zeitgeist, the overwhelmingly fascist zeitgeist, there are these maps that go around showing the average IQ in different countries, and shock among shocks, right? Like the global south all have like lower average IQ scores, and people keep bringing up, oh, but it's poorly measured, and that's true, but I don't think there's a baby in the bathwater. Like IQ, the reason that those IQ scores are lower is that the institution of IQ was invented to produce that result in order to justify the sorts of atrocities that have been enacted upon these people. It's an entirely circular mechanism. We're always going to see that colonized peoples are going to be measured as having lower IQ. We're always going to see that racialized peoples are going to be measured as having lower intelligence, lower rationality, not being sufficiently pro-social, because that is what this institution of intelligence, of rationality, this Enlightenment discourse is meant to do. And so that's my perspective, which is a very extreme perspective, right? People tend to want to not throw away the whole apparatus of intelligence, and I understand why. But if we were going to follow that line and be like, no, we really can't let anybody be called savage, we can't allow this institution to exist, what do we do? Like, what do we do about the fact that so many critiques of IQ just amount to saying, yeah, there's a real like underlying baby in the bathwater. There's a fact of the matter about intelligence, about rationality, about sanity, and IQ reports it in a way that's distorted by oppression. Because like the people who are measuring IQ are being racist in enacting it, but like as if there were some version of IQ that weren't racist qua institution. can we replace it with something? What do we do about the tendency to reach for the empty space where IQ used to be and replace it with like, this person's very bright, this person's very talented, this person's very meritorious. And how can we, given your experiences as neurodivergent people, given your experience of disabled people, how can we more aggressively not reach for that and not end up thinking of ourselves or wanting to think of ourselves as like smart, as intelligent, as the kind of people that were IQ to really measure the true thing would measure us as intelligent. Just to give a little more insight on the question. Sorry to throw that all on Cal. You have to solve the fundamental problems of history. But please.
Well,
go forward.
I hope whatever I say will suffice. So yeah, I mean there's a couple things I can say. One is, and I think this is probably what Will was referring to with the Sterner comment about me here, is that I think like this is in some ways one of the virtues of Sterner's model of insurrection, where it is not about trying to replace it with something new. In some ways, you can read the word revolution in the cyclical way as well. It's coming back to the same place. There's always this kind of replacing of the seat of power with another thing. It just can sometimes become more insidious and less visible. Instead, we, in some ways, try to depart from the system itself, where we withdraw. That's the fundamental idea of the insurrection as a model instead. And importantly, this is not in some ways a positive model. It isn't trying to say that we should like replace with something else. We should champion something else. It is in some ways a kind of ethic without a cause. And this is in some ways, I think, how we ought to approach some of these issues, where it is not about trying to find the right norms or expectations for us to kind of exist in society, but that we should be trying to depart from whatever norms or expectations there may be. Because in some ways, any kind of like taking up of the expectations or embodying the expectations is just reducing ourselves down to someone else's understanding of us. I will say, I think one exception is if we could do that in order to break the expectations better. If we can get closer to the king to slit his throat by being the jester. So yeah, I mean, I will also say, like, for some of these reasons, I think generally skeptical of kind of the liberatory power of history, which I don't think is anything that's super controversial with what we've already talked about with kind of Marx and prehistory. But I also am like somewhat critical of this kind of endlessly critiquing in some ways, where I see the attraction of the kind of the trap of the discourse in that kind of language, where we are kind of getting pulled into this system where now we are in some ways complying by its rules. And this is one of the reasons why I kind of like adopted or kind of expressed the idea of strategically using some of these things for ourselves, because I think that there's a certain kind of like concreteness to some of these interpersonal interactions where these are expectations that we're having to deal with, where like the immediate is what is like really the concern, where it's the fact that if you don't use this defense you will get executed, that like I do worry about. And it isn't that we shouldn't necessarily also worry about how this might end up getting used later on, but I don't think that we should almost be always universalizing our own actions in this way, that because I think that is itself kind of buying into the discourse that we should be trying to resist against. So I've said my piece.
Will, did you?
Yeah, sure. I can add to so in a certain sense what I want to try to to focus on here is that the critique of IQ is ultimately what I find to be, the overwhelmingly common critique of IQ ends with the upshot that one day intelligence will be good again. That one day we will have a notion of intelligence that is sufficient, that includes everybody. No one will be outside of the sphere of intelligence. It's something very common to the philosophers of the early 21st century who were trying to come up with a notion of the sphere of production that brought everyone in. I'm thinking of Antonio Negri, right, with the notion of the multitude, which he takes from Hobbes, and says, oh, we are all in production. Oh, we are all in intelligence. But what I want to
also tremendously affiliated with the new materialism, the ontological turn, the idea that once we eradicate the institution, all the spectrum of materiality is all in play. Yeah,
but what remains in play is always agentic capacity, which I presented about in the Disability and Social Change Conference last year. And I think that this has to remain in the realm of intellectual disability. That this is about the production, management, policing, and elimination of intellectual disability. And I think that the violence that is associated with the notion of intelligence is always undervalued. And I think that it continues to be undervalued, which is why I think that when it comes to questions of the relationship between power and knowledge production, or the relationship between revolt and revolution as it pertains to these central concepts of the intelligent human being, I think really the only stance that I can take is an ethical one. I have no program to put forward. And I'm reminded of the French anarchist collective, the anonymous collective, the Invisible Committee, who remind us that to destitute in Latin also means to disappoint. That there is no positive point that I can provide. And to the point about evading execution, absolutely, right? It's a tool for intellectual disability, can be a tool for defendants, etc. But my broader point was there are always going to be these moments in securitization that allow us to toy with it. The metropolis has all of these different things that it's built, and within it we can find all different ways to resist, ways to subsist. Persistence is, and subsistence and just overcoming is the key. Solving these issues is not the key, because I don't want to solve them on their terms. I don't want to solve the question of intelligence. I don't. If you desperately want to, then you have to accept where you are in the history of philosophy and whose side you're on. And I think that the refusal to accept that, to say that what I want to find is the real intelligence, well, my question is why? And the why is not some sort of pre-discursive element. The why is produced on the other side of this discussion. And and of course,
wait, I want to connect this to Clarissa's earlier point and get her take on this. Vis-a-vis this, like being like able disabled, which isn't, I know that's not the way you put it. I'm sorry, I don't mean to twist your words, but you've brought up this very salient point that I think relates to will. So I'm asking you this question now, which is the intellectual disability question. Basically, where are the intellectually disabled people? It's a damning evaluation. Like damning. I'll say it again. It is a damning evaluation of our field of study that there are not intellectually disabled people here. I'm going to be silent for like 3 seconds to like let that sink in. That we think we are critical, and that there aren't any intellectually disabled people here. It remains true. We have representation of all sorts of other disabled identities. And there might be something more we can do about it. And what you talked about, Clarissa, is this, both in the terms of, here are the norms, and we come into being, we come into these places, and we get told what the norms are. And then we have to satisfy these norms, and we carve out these places, but it's still like we are judged in terms of our satisfaction of these norms. Are there any ideas you have about like how we can change the norms, or even just like relying on your earlier like critiques of the norms, what insight do you think you can bring to this issue of the intellectual disability shaped hole in critical disability studies? Because we have writing on it, but we don't have identitarian. We need I would like to see an identitarian takeover, which obviously is not for me to do, but I would love to applaud it.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have quite a few thoughts and they're all going at the same time, so bear with me as I try and like iron them out into something intelligible. The irony. Yeah, so I wish I had the answer to what do we do about these norms, right? Like that would be amazing. In my own work, I approach them from like a Merleau-Pontian kind of perspective, throwing in Foucault for good measure. In more like a personal stance, you know. I just really like talking about it. Like, you know, like when I'm teaching students, I don't shy away from the fact that I'm disabled. Like if I'm teaching in late afternoon and my medication is wearing off and I'm beginning to get real sleepy and not focus on them as much, I tell them. I think there's something really radical about that. Because you see it takes them back then we're used to this kind of, I don't know, transparency. Especially from someone who they see as in an authoritative position, right? You know, I would reject saying that I am to a certain degree, although I know that I am, but I don't like that I am, perhaps is the best way to put it. And I do want to make that space as horizontal as possible. I think that's part of it. I think, who is it? Sarah Ahmed in Queer Orientations, her book back from 2006, she introduces this idea, this is a very heavy paraphrase by the way, that, you know, there are moments of discomfort or friction, and it's in those moments where you realize that you're touching on a norm, right? And you can either diverge from it, in my language, or you can converge with it. And in that convergent kind of movement, you know, it's almost like a flow state. Things that maybe a bit easy, versus the friction of divergence and this turning toward a new orientation and a new path. And I do think that there's a lot to be said about the notion of discomfort, both in terms of the discomfort of disabled people, both literally and metaphorically, like what that says, and why it occurs in the first place, in terms of like, I mean, obviously if we're talking about like physical literal pain, like I have chronic pain myself, and that obviously is a different conversation. I'm talking about like literal pain in this context, but insofar as the discomfort of being, I don't know, at a conference and you miss the entire Q&A because you were trying to figure out what to say and then you weren't able to, and now the conversation has moved on and you're beginning to reassess all of your life choices and whether or not you'll even be able to make it as an academic. You know, may or may not be a personal experience, up to like the pain of like, I don't know, trying to be in a classroom or enter a building where there still aren't any options to navigate other than stairs, you know, or there is an elevator but it's broken and not maintained because it's not seen worthwhile to do that, you know, or it's not seen like this paramount functional piece of that building for someone. And so I do think that there's something in the discomfort, but also in the discomfort generated in those convergent bodies at moments where others choose to diverge. Like that's something I'm very interested in. Not in the sense of so much as, how do I put this? Because I'm very hesitant around the idea of it being like the responsibility of the oppressed to educate the privileged. You know, that's questionable to say the least,
especially
right?
when the discursive norms are so incredibly slanted as they are in this case, where the intellectually able control of the discourse is hegemonic in ways that it's difficult to think of analogs for, although obviously, I mean, there's stuff like, you know, animal ethics, where obviously humans have exclusive control of the discourse. But barring those kinds of cases, this is really, the dynamic is so severe. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah,
I didn't mean
exactly.
to cut you off. I just wanted to emphasize.
Oh no, it's fine. No, I understand. And particularly like if we're like, you know, thinking about intellectual disability and presence representation in university, I mean, hopefully at this point it's not, you know, outrageous for me to say that, you know, universities aren't inclusive. They may claim to be, but I don't think that they are. And you know, the point that you raise about, you know, the lack of intellectually disabled people here is, you know, an elephant in the room with regard to that. And, I think we can't or shouldn't understate the fact that academia in particular and schooling, but I'll focus on academia for the sake of it. It's founded upon the idea of not just merit, but exclusivity, that only certain people can go there. And those certain people, both historically and contemporarily, are well-off white cis men predominantly, right? Western English speaking. And calling back to the idea that you had earlier, it's a feature, not a bug. And it's the same with IQ tests. Just coming back to that point is, I think I'm in broadly in agreement with the position that you had, Virgil, of I don't know if there is something we can extract for this, because I'm not convinced that IQ tests measure intelligence. Like in general, they measure something. What that thing is, I'm not sure.
They measure IQ score.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So I don't know if that makes me open to the idea that, we can redeem intelligence. I don't think I want to go that far. I don't really have a baked thought on that yet. But definitely, yeah, with regard to academia and the presence of intellectually disabled individuals, and with the question of IQ, yeah, it's a feature of the system, not a bug of the system that these people aren't here, and that even if they're spoken about whilst they're not in the room, which is a very big if anyway, this conversation is not a typical conversation that we're having, right? Or at least one that happens frequently. Again, is a symptom of that larger problem, I think. Now, does that mean that the response is to throw away all of academia? Probably not. Again, in a purely practical sense, is that doable? Yeah, that's not for me to say, but I would be skeptical of its feasibility. Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of rambling on a bit now. But with regard to the normative,
Cal has any.
Yeah, of course.
Did you have one more summarizing?
Yeah, just that I think that, when we're talking about merit and intelligence and the connection between those two and what kinds of people count within those two categories, I'm not sure, I like the Foucauldian quote of there are no margins. I come back to this idea a lot. And that if we want to try getting around talking about what intelligence is, what merit is, we're essentially talking about value, and systems of value. And so I don't think we'll ever get away from intelligence as a concept, because it would mean getting away from value systems. And again, I would be skeptical of the feasibility of that as a thing. So yeah, to me, this is a broader question around value systems and the way in which they're constructed and play out.
Cal, did you have anything to add?
Not much, other than I definitely agree with Clarissa's point that this is in some ways emblematic of a broader question of how it is that we value certain things and how and why we value certain things. The question of kind of IQ and intelligence to me is not one of what is the actual notion, but it is why is it that we care about this? Why is it given this certain privileged status? And that is just not entirely clear to me. Why is it that we organize things in this way around this notion? So I think in some ways we have to figure out, okay, why is it that we this is not a helpful question to ask, at least in this context, but why is it that we value things at all? Or how is that mechanism even happen? And I've kind of started working towards some aspect of this and trying to figure out kind of based off of some of the work on masking that I've done, which also I think, Verge, when you mentioned the editor, I think we are in the same collection. So
Can you tell us what the title of that selection is, so that people watching can keep an eye out for it? And the general, I'm not going to demand a direct.
Yeah. It's an existential. It's an existentialist perspectives on disability volume that came out of this conference that Melissa organized. Were you in the conference, Cal?
No, I was not.
Okay, well, basically the volume is, but it is the same volume.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Yeah, existentialist perspective, disability difference, existentialist perspectives. Do you want to give a brief summary of what your contribution is to the
Yeah,
volume?
so basically, so my kind of article is trying to solve the problem of how it is that people with ADHD can mask in the first place. Because the definitions that we have of masking are based on, or what I would call transcendent forms of masking, which is that it is based on this certain ability to consciously self-regulate. So kind of taking up a stance above yourself in order to make decisions about how you express yourself. And from what we know just generally both about the lived experience of ADHD, but there's also some scientific backing about like kind of how some of these things work. ADHD, it seems to be an impairment of the ability to kind of take that reflexive step on yourself. So to be able to act on yourself to regulate in the first place. So the question is, how is this kind of thing possible? Because people with ADHD, like myself, mask to even like really great degrees and really incredibly harmful degrees. So I kind of try to articulate a notion of immanent masking as opposed to a transcendent form of masking. I kind of give a notion of that, which is kind of long and complicated. And then I kind of talk about how it is, how we can see a similar notion take place in Stirner's kind of shift from his critique of socialism to humanism. And then I also articulate this notion to conclude about how to get out of masking, called the microinsurrection, which I've already talked a little bit about. And I talk about various forms of it and how humor is kind of an example of it. So that's the gist of it. But kind of based on like this kind of dynamic, so like one of the key ideas in how like immanent masking forms is it's based on the ways in which other people project their own expectations of others out onto the world and to other people and hold them accountable for such things. And this is kind of going back to the thing that I was mentioning just before. This is in some ways how I have been trying to investigate this question of why it is that we find certain things like IQ valuable or meaningful, where it is in some ways this kind of point around which people build their expectations as a way to orient themselves. Because I find that when you break a lot of these expectations that people project onto you, they can react very defensively as though it is their own like self-perception or self-identity that is being threatened, because you are in some ways challenging what the idea of their basically view of the world and how people should operate. So in some ways, it's challenging the way that they orient themselves socially. So that's going off on many tangents and everything. But yeah, so that's kind of the gist of what I was thinking about.
That's a very my essay in the volume is a similar topic. It's taking this question of why. It's also on the topic of choice, on the which I am sort of a eliminativist about. It's about how when addicts are always talking about how we can't control our drug use, and then suddenly we stop. And medical addiction theorists love to point to this and say, therefore, addiction is not a disease, it's a choice, which I don't think that's a real binary. I think it's a sort of like a, we keep paying attention to these two dinosaurs that are, like fighting each other and ignore the meteor, which is an argument that I made in another paper in FPQ in Mission Edited Volume. But basically I say that we can use some machinery from Jaspers to get around this, or to have a better perspective on how self-theorizing works for addicts. And basically by way of doing this, I line up, and sort of like yell at all of the existentialist theorists for how they talk about addicts, which is just really, really bad. And it's why it's the basis for why I am animated about the intellectual disability question, as I am, because I see it. I see people talk about me this way. And the way, I mean, take Heidegger, take even, you know, like modern existentialists, the way that they talk about anything like this, that they think that to be, in particular, an addict, but, you know, there's other kinds of people that they regard this way. It's to fundamentally be a failed person. Your existence defines the creation of this whole spectrum, that you are what it means to totally whiff it, to totally fail, to be even in the running for human excellence. You never even got started. And that's what I think our counterconduct should be based on. We're like basically out of time here. So I'm going to ask if anybody has any closing comments on this question around which we framed this whole thing, which is sort of like the tension of we're all academics and here we are talking in intellectual terms about, you know, we're like criticizing a ghost by like shooting its ectoplasm with ectoplasm bullets. What is there any like closing comments about this whole project, which I think we're sort of starting here, and I would very much like to continue, and then I'll thank the contributors and, you know, say bye.
I mean, I won't take up too much more time because I've already spoken a lot today, but I think this is definitely something that we all should discuss again. I'll send my, for anyone who wants to get in contact with anything, I'm going to send my email in the chat right now. But I would hope to discuss this topic and others like it with the panelists here at some point too. So thank you for having me and thank you for your time, everyone.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say something, well, something, as well on the point of revolt, although I'll keep it brief because of time. I come back to the idea a lot about games and playing games, and I've written a paper about how being neurodivergent is you're playing a game where you don't have the rules, but you're still expected to follow them, and they are invisible when you only realize them in the breach, and it's this wonderful way of existing in the world. And I think that there's something to that in this instance as well, right? The academia or the academy is a game. And there are rules that you can play, like you can, I don't know, acquire the various capital to gain recognition and esteem in that space, and probably find great success while doing so. But you can also try to not fully buy into it, right? Like to make change in a space, you do need to some degree play the game, right? Because otherwise no one will listen to you. So there's something to be said there. But that doesn't mean that you need to do so mindlessly or without reflection, or to not use that position that you then gain to do something effective for people who are less fortunate and frankly, you know, less privileged than you. So yeah, that is my final kind of thought on that. And again, yeah, I will follow Cal's lead because that's a good idea of chucking the email in the chat. And thank you both for, well, thank you all, but moderators for moderating and for the discussions that we've had today.
Will you have a closing comment before I sort of thank everybody?
No, I just want to thank everybody for being here, and to just remain, you know, just to remain in the position of danger, to understand the danger, and that's about it.
Stay critical. I appreciate that a lot. Remain in the position of danger. I want so this is terrific. I really appreciate the contributors. Thank you so much, Clarissa and Cal. Thank you so much to Will. And thank you in particular to the organizers of the conference, the Blavatnik School, to Shelley. Thanks to the other contributors, and to the wonderful audience and everybody who's popped any question or thought in the chat. I think I speak for everybody when I say that we love being able to discuss topics like this in, you know, for an audience like this and for a culture and a group of comrades like this. And I feel a little bit more optimistic than I did when this started, about, you know, like the future of this question, the future of work on this question. So if anybody has any new publications or any activism that you're doing, stuff you're working on, please, you know, pop that in the chat as well, or share that as well with the audience. And I'll put my email in the chat too. So thank you everyone for listening, and bye.
Well, thanks so much, Virgil, for chairing, and to Will and Cal, Clarissa, tremendous session. So that brings us to the end of the first day. I hope that you have all benefited from it. I'm sure you have. And we'll be back again tomorrow. So remains for me just to thank all the speakers today, everyone who asked questions, everyone who listened, and particularly to this last panel. So can you join me in thanking Virgil, Will, Clarissa, and Cal, and we will see you all tomorrow.